Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay, a first-year graduate student of Technical University Munich's Program of Responsibility in Science, Technology, and Society. This is our 9th episode of STS Shorts, a new video series from Eclectic Spacewalk, in which we dialogue with a researcher, lecturer, writer, and/or eclectic human in the science, technology, and society discipline or related fields. These shorts will only be around 30 minutes in length, and the goal is to highlight and hopefully introduce a new audience to our guests' research and work. Please grab a coffee, drink, and open your curious mind as we dive right in. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Youjung Shin. Youjung is an assistant professor at the Department of Science Studies at Jeonbuk National University. She is interested in the dynamics among knowledge, technology, and policy in the development of emerging scientific fields. The common theme of her research projects are to examine underlying material and social infrastructures in the production and circulation of scientific knowledge across the countries. Welcome to STS Shorts, Youjung.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really my big pleasure to be here.
I appreciate it. So first question, so can you just give us kind of a brief overview of your academic career and maybe how did you become interested in the STS field in the first place?
Yeah, great. Like I have a different kinds of versions, but a short version. So actually, when I was an undergrad, I majored in mechanical engineering. So
Okay.
I was a mechanical engineer. And at the time, I really hoped to be a good engineer who developed fascinating things in a lab, like mostly with a whiteboard. So I studied a lot, and my grade was not bad at the time. I was good at mechanical engineering. But then I remember that in around 2011 or so, there was some very sad and tragic event in our campus because a few students, very talented students, passed away in a row
Oh
by
no.
killing themselves at the time. And that was a very shocking to me and to all of our colleagues. And actually, at the time, the university also decided to cancel all the classes for 2 days. So it was really shocking events. And that events made me to think about like the way we study science, the way we do science, and the way we develop science in society.
Mhm.
And right at that moment, I happened to take a course named Science and Technology Policy, which explores the development of science and technology from historical and STS perspective. And there I realized how this, interaction between science and society does matter in shaping the
Mhm.
kinds of questions we ask, the kinds of questions scientists ask, and the kinds of material scientists use, and like ultimately the kind of work we made with science and technology, right? So from that moment, I decided to switch my major from mechanical engineering to STS and STP, science and technology policy, in a broader sense. And then I studied STS, and then right now I'm here in Department
Yeah.
of Science, right?
Oh, that's a beautiful journey. Even like taking something generative from something that's kind of tragic. Is there any like other than the kind of the events? Do you remember? I guess you could say maybe one of the first things you read that kind of just solidified your, maybe it was a paper or a talk or something like that that you kind of was just like, "Yep, I'm on the right direction." After you changed or maybe made the change.
I think I didn't recall the exact reading, but
Mm-hmm.
I believe I think it was about the class about Manhattan Project
Mm-hmm.
and Cold War big science in the United States. And I remember the class that like the professors let students feel the struggles of scientists in the modern society, like especially in the Cold War period, in a very politically confusing moment and economically confusing moment. And I remember that the professor tried to let students understand the very complicated relationship between science, policy, and economy
Mm-hmm.
um, for context. And I like by listening the Manhattan Project story and the stories about scientists in Manhattan Project, I began to realize the importance of this dynamics between science and society in order to think about like good science in a society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was the moment that I realized, oh, there's much more thing we have to talk about outside the laboratory in order to talk about the science.
Very interesting. So, as I mentioned in the opening, you're interested in dynamics among knowledge, technology, and policy in the development of emerging scientific fields, and that a common theme of your research project is to examine underlying material and social infrastructures in the production and circulation of scientific knowledge across the country. So when a scientific field is really emerging, I mean, we can think of AI and robotics and all the new kind of things. Where are the critical areas that could have heavy influence on its trajectory? I'm thinking specifically if you go upstream, to epistemic activism and going to how the field is kind of conceptualized, being reflexive about who is considered an expert or has knowledge as the field, kind of progresses. And then actually the material and social infrastructures that are created, exacerbated, or erased, as a, technology kind of takes hold within a society. So maybe talk about some of those critical areas that have heavy influence.
So you mean areas like, okay, so let's say, I think it's really interesting question, and it really captures my epistemic curiosity.
Yeah.
So because basically, so I'm interested in the way, as you mentioned, in the way a new scientific field or a new research group emerged, especially at the intersection of various existing traditional disciplines. So
okay.
I treated this boundary between existing disciplines and its intersection as a place of valuing particular ideas and practices among different possibilities. So it's a very abstract, and there have been a lot of studies which explored, for example, what played a role in this process of combining and conflicting and merging different ideas and practices at this intersection. Like, for example, Peter Gallison also pointed out the importance of the role of language, Creole, in this so-called trading zone. And Susan Laystar also emphasized the role of boundary object in this process. So language, object, material, a lot of things. But what I'm interested in here, along with these, is the role of public policy. So how public policy played a role in shaping I believe the public policy played a role, especially in the 20th century. And I'm interested in how public policy played a role in shaping the way trading zone itself is made and mediated, and how it affected the way we value ideas and practices at the boundary between disciplines. So I began to believe that public policy is an important area that we have to look in order to understand the construction and evolution of trading zone, especially in the particularly in the mid and late 20th century. So I'm trying to merge our understanding of the role of language and material here with new understanding on the role of public policy in the production and circulation of scientific knowledge in the 20th century. And I really like your frame, epistemic activism, in terms of this. And I think I really touched upon I'm trying to go into that direction,
upstream.
Exactly. So yeah, I think I can say that.
Okay, very interesting. And then and we'll get into kind of more socio-technical imaginaries and some of the things that you've actually written about. But I guess just as a kind of side question, because we have you here, you're based in South Korea, and you've been to MIT and Johns Hopkins. I mean, how would you see, because we talked about this before that we started recording and stuff, and it was very generative, I think, and be a boon to our listeners to kind of see maybe a little bit of the differences of how kind of the United States or the West or is kind of views science and technology versus maybe Asia or other kind of parts of the world. Because I think there is maybe a self-reflection or a reflexivity, really, the STS, I think, could be useful here, you know? And so maybe from your point of view or your kind of situated knowledge, if we want to get to it, of you kind of traveling between the two or spending some time in both, what are kind of the strengths, or maybe not strengths, but differences, could be valuable, could be not valuable, that maybe, you know, the West versus Asia kind of see things? And again, like we'll get into socio-technical imaginaries here in a minute.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I wanted to say, but first of all, I don't want it to make some kinds of national characteristic or something like that.
Sure.
I don't want it to make a Korean something,
Mm-hmm.
but I believe that it is really important, as you mentioned, to understand the situatedness of the knowledge, including STS knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So, when I was a graduate student, I read a lot of stuff about STS theories and STS concepts, which used a lot of United States case or European case, or like the other cases other than Korea or the Asian stuff. And for me, honestly, it was a bit difficult for me to understand exactly what the case meant, because I did not like share the common United States experience
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. So I began to realize, it's a very interesting, but I cannot really like 100% get it. And I really wanted to see the case of South Korea or the case of Asia from STS perspective. And I realized how difficult it is to make such a how difficult it is to find such a literatures and like make such a literatures. So that's a one point. And with having this in mind, I began to do my research, and I happened to publish one article, so-called it's published in IEEE History of Computing,
Okay.
and the article title is "The Spring of AI in South Korea in its Global Winter," and it is the article about so basically it's about like the global AI winter period. Mostly people remember that the 1980s, late 1980s, as the second global AI winter period. That's a basic kinds of understanding. And even if you see the textbook, you can see that kinds of graph that shows like first AI boom and winter and something like that. Everyone read it. Even students in South Korea also read, okay, this period was global AI winter period. The end, right? But then I began to realize that in South Korea, that second global AI winter period, that period was exactly the moment when the field of AI took off and began to spring. There are various reasons. There are very intellectual reasons as well as very institutional reasons. There are various reasons, but basically that was the period when the field of AI itself took off in South Korea. So that was the spring period in the global AI winter period. And then I realized, wow, this is really interesting. And why haven't we talked about this, right? Even though the AI winter, even though the United States underwent global AI period and it's not global AI winter period, right? It's
Right.
AI in the United States. But if you if you shift your eyes to other regions, you can see a lot of different attempts, a lot of different efforts, a lot of different practices at the time. And by doing so, you can see a lot of you can see more like how can I say, more rich stories about AI and about the practices of AI, imaginations of AI. You can see more rich stories and resources out there. The only thing you have to do is just shift your eye to other areas and other people, right? And then I began to realize, okay, this is important. I believe this is important. And I believe this should be also taught in other, at least in South Korea, instead of seeing the general kinds of this picture, AI, winter and spring, something like that. And with this article, I began to realize how comparative research is valuable of situating our understanding of the relationship between science and society, like STS itself, how it is important to situate STS framework itself by doing comparative research. And I began to believe that it's really important to do that. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's very cool, and I think that that'll give the viewers a little bit more of what we had a 30-minute conversation before this that we didn't really record. So I'm glad that we got to put it in there. So moving on a little bit. So in February of 2020, you gave a talk titled "Linking the Brain, Computerization, Biomedicalization, and Globalization in Neuroscience, 1960 to 2000." So a little bit, in that Cold War period and all the other rest of it. But the talk was about the different evolutionary processes of the quote computer revolution in neuroscience in the U.S. and South Korea, which culminated in the American Human Brain Project. So we teased a little bit about socio-technical imaginaries, how Jasanoff kind of took nuclear power or nuclear energy and framed it between the differences of South Korea and the United States, in her groundbreaking article and stuff. But can you talk us through some of the historical differences between countries and their socio-technical imaginaries between the computer revolution? I think that's super interesting and generative because, like you just mentioned, you have to shift your eyes a little bit from the different regions and compare because it's not all the same in different places.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that. Like, I think it was like it's a 2008. It's 2 years ago already.
Yeah,
right?
right.
Yeah, thanks for bringing out that. And I think it's also related to the article that I mentioned, like the Spring of AI. That article is also related with this topic as well. So like basically, like I'll talk about like the historical differences in neuroscience, and then I will talk about social technical imaginaries next. But first of all, like, so if I began to see this nexus of policy, knowledge, material triangle and its impact on the way neuroscientific knowledge is developed in different countries. And then I began to see that, so two notable things. There were two notable things. Like first was that I realized that in the 1990s, the Korean government decided to pass the law, so the so-called Brain Research Promotion Act.
Okay.
And there, they decided to use the term brain research instead of neuroscience. They
Interesting.
deliberately decided to use different terms indicating the modern study of the brain. And then brain research, the term brain research was combined with brain science, brain engineering, and brain medicine.
Wow.
So
Okay.
you can see, and it was not just a one-time temporary event, but it was the result of the way Koreans valued the brain as a research object in a specific like material and social context. And it also affected later the production and circulation of neuroscientific knowledge in South Korea. And if I linked the previous article that I mentioned, the AI stuff to here, you can see the influence of the spring of AI in the late 1980s. The subgroup of AI, especially neural network researchers, became the group of brain engineering in the name of brain research.
Wow, interesting.
So you can see different ways of valuing the brain and brain research in South Korea in the late 1980s and the 1990s. And the result was that while in the United States, neuroscience was established as the peak of the modern study of the brain from the 1960s. And there's a lot that I wanted to say about the United States stories because there's a Russia Cold War stuff or something like that. But while that happened in the United States, you can see totally different kinds of practices and imaginations came around the brain and brain research, and it turned out to be the result was that instead of using neuroscience, the Korean government began to use the term brain research. And what was the impact of that? So because there was an impact, because for example, when the American Human Brain Project was spread in the 1990s by the OECD in particular, Korea also participated in. So there was a kinds of international collaboration project around the brain in the 1990s. And there, what happened was that while most of the like many countries sent their experts about brain
Mm-hmm.
research
Mm-hmm.
science. And what happened there was while most of the experts they came to the OECD at the time was like in other countries was mostly biologists and medical scientists, medical basic scientists, basic researchers in neuroscience. That was the majority.
Mm-hmm.
While
Mm-hmm.
that happened, uh, the from the Korean side, it was an electrical engineer who developed at the time neurochip, who went to the OECD as a representative of the brain research, and he began to do some collaborative thing, and he began to try to do some collaborative thing as a brain researchers, the representative of brain researchers in South Korea, and how it affected the way Korean collaborated the international project and how it affected the international project. That's what I'm still digging in. But you can but you can see different ways of valuing the brain in different countries and its impact on the shaping of the trading zone around the
Mm-hmm.
brain
Mm-hmm.
countries. And that you can imagine how that affected the way new knowledge and practices about the brain came to society in different forms.
That's well said. And so maybe let's go back a little bit, because I think this is also generative, is like your dissertation kind of focused more on policy and specifically with shaping this brain science. So the title being, quote, Policy for Interdisciplinarity, Shaping Brain Science in the US and South Korea, 1960 to 2000. So again, like kind of very similar to what we just kind of talked about, but then maybe I think it would be even better to then how has the policy changed since then, you know, since you wrote this, and then what are some of the factors that have been maybe more apparent now that maybe weren't before? I mean, we don't have to rehash the whole dissertation, because as I've asked this before, every time I ask a thing about a dissertation, everyone is either like, yeah, it's not even valid or anymore, or I think, you know, negative thoughts about it, but it's out there and I finished it. But like, so what, how have things changed?
Their dissertation, right?
100%, 100%. So I don't want to like rehash any of those horrors, but at the same time, like maybe it would be beneficial to kind of hear how some of that policy has changed since, you know, you wrote the dissertation, and then maybe what are some, you know, interesting factors that maybe are more apparent now that weren't that when you wrote it.
Yeah. I wanted to say two things. Like, first thing is that like it's about the dissertation. The one thing is that whenever we talk about the policy in brain research or policy in neuroscience, everyone talked about, like, for example, the decade of the brain in the 1990s, like brain initiative in 2000, something like that. But one point that I highlight in my dissertation was that no, that's not the first time that policy had an impact in brain research. And then I came to go back, like from the 1960s, the moment that the neuroscience was emerged in the United States the first time. And I from there, I began to show how public policy, including basic research policy, big science policy, something like that, began to affect the field of neuroscience at the time. And so by doing so, I try to highlight, whenever you talk about like brain research policy, decade of the brain, is it all? No.
Right.
You have to broaden your perspective about what public policy is, what science policy. You have to broaden your like perspective, what science policy is. So that's my one point. So I began to like examine the role of public policy from the 1960s in the United States to the 1990s in the United States, also in South Korea and OECD, something like that. And since then, what happened in neuroscience, the biggest event was the launch of the Human Brain Project in European countries.
Okay.
And that was the big event. And it actually, there is also a link between the American Human Brain Project and European Human Brain Project. Everyone talked about European Human Brain Project, but few remember there was an American Human Brain Project, and there is actually a link. But still, the European Brain Project was huge. Like it costed a lot, and it was a really controversial project, and it like raised a lot of controversies over the proper amount of money that we have to spend on such big projects and the role of computing infrastructure, information infrastructure, because the European Human Brain Project basically tried to simulate the brain, full brain at the initial stage, though it changed a bit. And that European Human Brain Project also like began to influence the United States and South Korea and other countries as well. And I found one scholars in France, his name is Jeonbuk Kim, and I met him like via email first, but he is now working on dissertation on European Human Brain Project.
Okay.
We met, and then we began to share our kind of research experience and then finding and then perspectives, and we began to realize if we combine together, because I worked at the American Human Brain Project, he worked at European Human Brain Project, also in relationship with Korea, and we are now at the stage of doing some collaborative work over the Human Brain Project right now. So that's what I can say.
Oh, that's great. That the meeting of the minds, but then the fact that you guys have different synergies that and from the Korean kind of perspective, very interesting. So I think I'm gonna like just combine the last two questions, because now after I'm looking at it, it seems a little like they're kind of one and the same. So data, data or whatever has been called, the new oil, if you will. But as STSers and other researchers have concluded, data is only as valuable as its data set, so what is it's feeding? So how it was formulated, what was accounted for, and what was omitted, et cetera. And your Twitter profile states, quote, following the move of biomedical data across societies and countries. So I really like that. But then as we've kind of just gone over, you've described neuroscience as inherently multi and interdisciplinary. And you have a forthcoming paper, quote, screening as governmental technology, the nationwide collection of mental health data on students in South Korea. Super interesting and timely topic, with social media's rise and our rapidly connected world. And at least in the United States, social media has had a, big kind of impact on mental health and stuff. So how should we as social scientists begin to think about data, and specifically, biomedical data? And then can you elaborate more on the politics behind like screening, mental health, or otherwise? Those I think two questions are kind of one and the same. Is how can social scientists begin to think about data, especially biomedical data, and then how maybe is that biomedical data used, in the real world with different politics behind it, the screening, mental health, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a big question though.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Basically, as you mentioned, like it's really easy to hear that data is a new oil, and it's really easy to see the metaphor like data flow or data flows, like a liquid metaphor about the data.
Right.
But many STS scholars, I think, have pointed out, also historians of science have pointed out, like data does not flow like that.
Yeah, no.
Not a water, right? Even if you like use the metaphor of the water, you should think about the pipeline, right? But still, but data is like not at all the water. And many STS scholars have pointed out the importance of looking the way data is the context, like the very specific context in which data is produced, circulated, and used and reused. And that's the way STS scholars have to engage right now, have been engaged in the flow of data. And I really liked, I'm not sure whether you know her, but I really liked the Sabina Leonelli's work. She's my best.
Okay.
Sabina Leonelli, philosopher of science, and she framed this data flow as the travel of the data, like it's a data travel. And she's a philosopher, and she began to investigate the philosophical meaning at each stage of data travel. So the production stage, circulation stage, reuse stage. And she began to show how in this flow of data, in this travel of data, how the decontextualization happened, how many recontextualization happens, and then how these kinds of flexibility and these kinds of how can I say, dynamics affected on the way data is used and valued in a society. So, and STS scholars have pointed out because of that, and very emphasized a lot that we have to ask, if whenever you see the data, it is really important to ask from where it came from and how, by whom it has been created and moved, and in what context it has been used, and something like that. So I think that's why the very STS perspective is important in understanding the travel of the data. In terms of the biomedical data stuff, because especially biomedical came from the human body and human species itself, it is really more, I think it is more important to think about in what way data is produced, biomedical data, and how it is used and reused. And then it's very sensitive issue, and there has been a lot of discussions. And if I link to the article that you mentioned with this, my new paper will be like, it's a success paper. The title is Screening as Governmental Technology, and it's about, so in South Korea, I didn't know that, but like South Korea became the first country in which the government undertook the nationwide mental health screening on students. So it was a kind of attempt to gather all the big data about students' mental health. And actually it was tried first in the United States, but then it failed because there was a lot of protest, a lot of criticism. But then like a few years later, it happened in South Korea.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
I in that article, I examined the role of, especially there's a lot of different things, but I examined the role of multinational pharmaceutical company in happening all of this. And by showing how these the practice of gathering big data, that kind of how that thing could happen in South Korea, by showing that I'm trying to see how big data like came to be gathered, from whom, by what, like in what form. So that's the thing that I tried to show in that article. But I think I'm like over time, right?
No. We could no.
Yeah.
So what?
Yeah.
So maybe can if that's something, what are your kind of, if that's kind of been accepted and coming out and et cetera. So what future projects are you working on now, or kind of what's in the pipeline? You mentioned off air that, you're kind of in syllabus mode and stuff, but I guess quickly, you can tell us any other future things you're thinking about, interesting problems. I guess a lot of it still is going to be dealing with, biomedical data, across society, countries, but it maybe tease out a little bit of what you're kind of working on.
Yeah, that's great. It's a preview, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, my future project, I think I'm now working on like including the human brain project. Human brain project became a really representative, big project in biology, including that I began to see what it meant to do big science in small country like Korea. And like from the 1990s, like big science became a very international collaborative effort, and many countries began to do collaborative work for big science. And then I began to I began to curious, like what is the meaning of doing big science in middle country like South Korea. So not only the human brain project, but also like accelerator things, particle physics things, something like that. So big science in middle country, that's one of my future projects. But of course, in addition to that, I will also keep continuing working on the collaborative project that I mentioned over the human brain project, information infrastructure in neuroscience and in South Korea, and also about like the history of human science, especially about the brain. Like I'm also like interested in the way of writing the history about boundary objects, the brain, something like that. Yeah, that might be my future project.
Awesome. Well, we're definitely looking forward to it, and I appreciate your time, and I think that really gives a summarization of a lot of your work and stuff. So I hope everyone kind of checks out the papers and follows your story and stuff. But just want to say thanks again for coming on STS Shorts, Youjung.
Thank you very much.
Cool.